So for session 2, what I'd like for us to do is actually look at some of the women in the pages of Scripture and the roles that they filled. And by seeing these women in Scripture, recently a well-known male preacher said that there was no evidence anywhere in the Bible of women who did leadership and took on ministry roles. And I turned to my husband when he said that, and I said, I would like to have a live debate with this person. And my husband, with his little West Texas accent, said, well, make sure the ambulance and the fire department's there. So I want to take you guys just through some of the women that are mentioned. And this is not an exhaustive list. There are more than the ones that I'm giving to you. These women are left out so often. They're put into the shadows. And one of my personal missions is to pull these ladies out of the shadows so that we can look at them and see them as they really were and see what they really did, because these women paved the way for the women in the church today. There were quite a few women in the book of Genesis that were significant and important, starting with Eve. It was Eve who had the conversation with the serpent, Eve who made the decision, wrong that it was, but it was also Eve of whom the Lord promised that from her seed would come the one who would bruise his head, even though his heel would be bruised. So you see, God, I told Des one time, I said, Des, it's like God made a covenant with Eve. So the first covenant in all of Scripture is between God and Eve. And Des shook his head and said, Mati. No one has ever heard of such a thing. So Eve was significant in that she was the mother of all living and had a place of honor. I did a teaching last year on this, and you could probably pick it out of the archives if you cared to go back through it. It would be December of 2018. But I compared Mary and Eve. If Jesus was the second Adam, then the church or Mary becomes the second Eve. Because think about it. Eve said, yes, Lord, be it unto me according to your word. Eve said, let me think about it. Eve ate from the wrong fruit, and Mary ate from the right fruit. There's just some beautiful symbolism and comparison between the two. So Eve is important. Sarah is the second woman of importance that's mentioned. It wasn't just a covenant that God made with Abraham. It was a covenant that he made with Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was not going to be able to have a child with another woman. It had to be a child with Sarah. When God changed Abraham's name, he also changed Sarah's name. And when God visited with Abraham to tell him this time next year your wife is going to be pregnant, the first thing he said is, where's Sarah? And Abraham said she was inside the tent, and she wasn't. She was standing at the door listening, because everything that concerned Abraham concerned her. Sarah was a strong woman. Obviously, Abraham listened to Sarah, because when Sarah said, I am old, cannot produce a child for you, here's Hagar, let Hagar bring forth a child. It was a bad idea, but Abraham did listen to her. And then when there arose animosity between Sarah and Hagar, and Sarah kicked Hagar out of the household, Abraham never interrupted that. He stayed out. He was smart. He stayed out, but Sarah had power. Sarah had position. And then finally, after Ishmael is making fun of Isaac at his circumcision, then Sarah goes to Abraham and says, the baby of this servant woman will not grow up with my child. And it grieved Abraham, because Abraham loved Ishmael. And the Lord spoke to Abraham and said, listen to your wife. Powerful words. Listen to your wife, which again shows Sarah wasn't superior to Abraham, But Sarah had her own place of importance and authority and power alongside of Abraham. Then let's look at Hagar. I think Hagar is maybe the most innocent victim in this little party between Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. Every indication is that Hagar was someone that Sarah picked up while they were in Egypt because she's Egyptian. Chances are she was one of the daughters of Pharaoh. And so she had been a princess her entire life, and now she is the maidservant to Sarah. Then she becomes the baby mama. And being the baby mama gave her a whole new place of power with Abraham and everybody else. And she's going to use this power now to its greatest extent. And so she begins to basically let Sarah become her handmaid now. Sarah doesn't like that. And so then begins the play between Sarah and Hagar. So Hagar runs away because Sarah's being mean to her. So Hagar runs away from home. And when she runs away from home, she finds herself in a difficult situation because she's in the desert. No one lives in the desert alone because there are marauders that will kill you, enslave you, do horrible things to you. And if the marauders do not get you, then the elements themselves, the fire heat by day and the freezing cold by night. And so she is no match for the natural and for the evil elements that live in the desert or that exist in the desert. And so she runs as far as she can, and finally God stops her and says to her, Hagar, from where do you come and to where do you go? That's a powerful question because sometimes I think we like to run. And I think the Father asks us that same question. What you running from and what do you think you're running to? Because sometimes what we run from is not nearly as bad as what we're running toward. And sometimes the thing that we run from, we carry it with us and it grows horns and fangs on the journey. And we're running to just more of what we left because we're not dealing with what we left behind. And Hagar declares, you are El Roi. One of the first times that we're given one of the names for God in the Old Testament, El Roi. El meaning God, powerful creator God, and Roi, who sees me. You are the God who sees me. Not just a God who has a visual on me, but a God who sees through me. And you know my heart, even if I'm not saying it. You know my motives. You know all my agendas. You see through me. But he's also a God who sees to me, meaning that he takes care of me. He sees me, he sees through me, he sees to me. He is the God who takes care of it. Now, in a few chapters later, Abraham is going to be taking Isaac to offer him to the Lord at the command of the Lord. And he's going to see that there's a ram caught in the thicket, and there he is going to say, Jehovah Jireh. Jehovah being the covenant name for the covenant people of God, and Jireh is just another form of the word Roi. You are the God who sees to it. You're the God who provides and takes care of it. Before Abraham knew him as Jehovah Jireh, God had revealed himself to Hagar as El Roi. Let that sink in for just a moment, the impact of that. We're talking about Abraham, the father of Israel. And yet before God reveals himself to Abraham as Jehovah Jireh, he reveals himself to Hagar as the God who sees to it. And that is powerful. She is an incredible woman that not too many people talk about because it's just easier to ignore her than it is to truthfully and honestly look at her story. Another woman is Rebecca. Rebecca is, again, an awesome woman. If you read the story of Rebecca in the book of Genesis, you find that when the servant of Abraham goes to find a bride for Isaac, Rebecca is the first woman that he meets. He's got 10 camels. I've been around camels. I've ridden a camel. They are some of the nastiest creatures that God has ever created. They will sneeze on you, and it's not a nice little polite sneeze. It is a sneeze that will get you wet from the top of your head to the tip of your toes, and it's nasty. And I'll stop with the description there. Each camel can drink between 20 and 50 gallons of water, and she has 10 of them. That's at least 200 and maybe as many as 500 gallons of water. Rebecca sees this servant, and she says, I will get water for your camels. She's taken on a huge job. So she is a woman who sees herself as someone who can do it. She is not some frail little flower in the desert, fearful that some wind is going to come by and break her. She's a woman who said, you got 10 camels? Buy about 400 gallons of water? Sure, not a problem. I'll water your camels. She waters his camels, and while she's watering his camels, the servant says, Lord, is she the one? And he says to her, who is your father? And she says, my father is Laban. And Laban is the brother of Rebekah, and the ancestor, going to be the ancestor, or an ancestor along with Abraham, because Milcah, I think it was Milcah, was the brother of Abraham. So you're seeing the family connection here. And so he goes into the household of Laban, and the servant says, I'm not going to sit here and waste time giving you all the details. Here's the bottom line. My master sent me to find a wife for his son Isaac. My master Abraham sent me to find a bride for his son Isaac. And then he brings out all the gifts. And he gives gifts to Rebekah and to Laban and to Laban's mother. And they said, well, here's the girl. Ask her yourself. This is unheard of in the ancient world. Let her decide if she wants to go with you or not. This woman can make up her own mind. And while we might not think much of that in this culture, in that culture, that was huge. And she says, I'll go. The camels that she watered, I just got to get a teaching moment in here. The camels that she watered are going to become her transportation to Isaac. Sometimes we have to water some camels, but the camels that we water can become our transportation to our groom. And I'm not talking about a physical husband, but to our groom, Jesus. And we are all in this room, Rebekahs, needing to water the camels, the unpleasant, the unruly, the uncomfortable circumstances and situations in our life. Sometimes they take on the form of people that we might work with, or that we might have to live in close quarters with. But that whole scenario, Rebekah is a strong woman who can make up her mind, and she knows what she wants. And then there's Leah. I like Leah better than Rachel for a lot of reasons. I think I identify with Leah more than with Rachel. Rachel, her name means little ewe lamb. Rachel's a little manipulator. She has learned to take her beauty and her looks and to use them to her advantage. I'm sure no one in this room knows someone like that. Leah's not so attractive, but Leah has heart and soul. She loves Jacob. It wasn't her idea to trick him. She just did what her father Laban told her to do. And there's that name Laban again. She just does what her father Laban tells her to do. But she loves Jacob, even though he doesn't reciprocate that love. And this woman stays with him, honors him, respects him, is faithful to him, knowing that he really loves her sister. The first child that she has, she says, she calls him Reuben. And Reuben means, it's either Reuben or Simeon. The first one is Reuben, and it means, now he will see me. She's saying, I've had a son for him, now he'll see me. He'll see past the fact that I'm not attractive, and he'll see to the heart and soul of who I am. But it didn't work. And she had a second son, and she named him Simeon. Simeon means, now he will hear me. Listen to the compromise. He doesn't have to see me. He can close his eyes if he will just hear me and hear that I have dreams and desires and hopes and aspirations. But that didn't work either. And she has a third son, and she names him Levi, and Levi means to connect. Now he will connect to me. He doesn't have to see me. He doesn't have to hear me. If he can just feel me, if he can just feel a little connected to me. But obviously that didn't work either, because she had a fourth son, and something happened to this woman between the birth of the third son and the fourth son, because she's no longer trying to get her husband to see her, to hear her, to connect with her. She names her fourth son Judah, which means God be praised. She's making an incredible leap here, and she's saying, I'm no longer looking to that man to meet the deepest needs in my life. I am looking to God to do that. God be praised. And it said, and she stopped bearing children after that because she had what she needed. Guys, it was a woman who made that jump and who made that connection and that leap, and it's powerful. And then, of course, there's Rachel. Rachel has power. She has esteem. She has privilege. And then there's Tamar. Tamar is the daughter-in-law of Judah. And Tamar is married to Judah's son, and Judah's son dies before they get pregnant. And according to the Levirate law of marriage, the next oldest son becomes the husband of Tamar to bring children for his dead brother. So the second son did not want to fulfill his Levirate law of marriage, because if he were to impregnate Tamar, then what that meant is that son got all of his inheritance plus all of the older brother's inheritance, and he did not want it. And without giving any more specifics, Scripture says that he spilled his seed on the ground, and this displeased God. He was using Tamar for enjoyment, but not fulfilling his responsibilities and obligations to her and to God. And God was angry, and he died. And at that point, Judah's thinking, I don't know about giving her a third son because it's not looking too good over here. He told her to go and live with her father. This is a place of disgrace for a married woman. Go back and live with your father until the youngest son is old enough to be your husband. And so the youngest son, actually, Judah marries him off to someone else. And Tamar finds out about it, and she's incensed. So Tamar dresses up like a prostitute. And because she knows that Judah, after the harvest is over, Judah's going to come into town and he's going to be looking for a good time. So she dresses up like a prostitute. She covers her face. She entices Judah. Judah buys in. He has no money. She keeps his signet ring and his staff, and she becomes pregnant by Judah. And so Judah gets word that his daughter-in-law is now pregnant, and he says, she has played the harlot, she is going to die. And so he goes to her to confront her, and she brings out the signet ring and the staff, and she said, I am pregnant by the man who owns these. These are not the actions of a less than human being. These are not the actions of someone who doesn't have the ability to think clearly and come up with a good plan. Because Judah says, you have acted more righteously than I have. And so she bears Judah's son, and Tamar is one of 5 women that end up in the lineage of Christ. She risked everything to do what she believed was right. I don't recommend anyone dress up like a harlot or anything like that. That was once. We're not going to do it again. But just to let you know, these are women who had brains and knew how to use them. Women who had business sense and leadership skills. Women that were respected by God himself. Women who carried the revelation of who God is even before some of their male counterparts. In the book of Genesis, the book opens in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. We are introduced to not one woman, not 2 women. We are introduced to 5 women. I do a little series, I call it 5 Women and a Male Child, because I think that we find in these 5 women, all of them were necessary for Moses to come forth and to be a deliverer for Israel and a spokesman for God. These 5 women, I'll put 2 of them together, Puah and Shiphrah. These are the midwives. We don't know the name of the Pharaoh. If we knew the name of the Pharaoh, we could date the Exodus down to the day. We know the names of the midwives, but not the Pharaoh. I think that this is an indication that God rewards faithfulness and righteousness. And Pharaoh was none of those things, and so therefore his name is not important in the economy of God. But Puah and Shiphrah, Their names are important. These women were told by Pharaoh to kill all the male children of the Hebrew women. And they did not do it because they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. I am looking toward the day when God will raise up men and women who fear God more than they fear political entities and powers, to where we fear God more than public opinion, to where we fear God more than we fear Wall Street, where we fear God more than we fear unemployment, where we just fear God in a righteous, biblical sort of way. So Puah and Shiphrah, it says of these two women that they feared God, and God rewarded their faithfulness and gave them families of their own. That indicates to me that these women were helping others get babies when they themselves did not have children. So this is a picture of human beings who are willing to help other people get what they themselves want and do not have. One of the most powerful things any of us will ever do is to pray for someone else who needs the same thing as we do. If you are sick in need of a healing, find somebody else that's sick in need of a healing, and you pray for them and watch Jesus heal you. You need a financial breakthrough, financial miracle, you find someone that's struggling financially, start praying for them, and you watch God give you your breakthrough. Guys, this is not like a lucky charm or a formula. This really works. Because when you pray for God to bless someone else, you end up being the one that gets blessed. So Puah and Shiphrah, they were willing to disobey Pharaoh's orders. They were willing to help others get what they themselves wanted but didn't have at the time. Then there's Yael. This is the mother of Moses. This woman was willing to birth it forth and let it go. Stuart and I have tried twice to adopt, and both times it was a failed adoption. It was painful, but I watch these little mamas, and before that baby gets here, they're like, yes, I can let this baby go. Yes, I can adopt this baby. No question about it. Not going to change my mind. But then the minute they see that baby and hold that baby, it's over. And the adoption becomes far more difficult, if it can even take place at all. But this woman, Yael, was willing to birth it forth and let it go because she knew that if Moses stayed with her, he would be killed. And so she was willing to bring it forth and let it go. That is a strength that very few human beings, male or female, can have. So Puah, Shiphrah, Yael, and then Miriam. Miriam is the daughter of Yael and the sister of Moses. And so her mother says, as she puts the baby in the little basket and covers it up, she says, follow it to see what becomes of the child. And so Miriam sees Pharaoh's daughter. They're poor. They barely eat. They work. They're slaves. And they see the princess of Egypt fish out her brother and fall in love with him, I think, immediately, and adopt him as her own child. I wonder if there wasn't just for a moment when Miriam thought, seriously? I'm going to have to go back and make bricks and slave and barely get food and have to face the whip of the taskmaster, and that little brat is going to grow up in Pharaoh's household with a silver spoon stuck in his mouth. I mean, I wonder if those thoughts circulated in her brain. But she was willing to be the right person at the right time, because when Pharaoh's daughter picked him up and said, I need someone to nurse this child, Miriam was right there saying, I know a Hebrew woman. And so Yael got to nurse her baby and get paid for it. And that's a beautiful thing that God does. And so again, you find another strong woman. And then there's Pharaoh's daughter. It's her father that made the law that all the Hebrew children, the male children, were to be put to death. And here she is breaking her father's law to fish this baby out and to adopt him as her own. She is not afraid of Pharaoh because she has power and position and prestige all of her own. And she's willing to do what is right. So I think with all of these women in Genesis and in Exodus, you find strong women who are in as much of a leadership position as you could possibly imagine. Miriam, going back to Miriam, In Exodus 1, we find that Miriam is a protector because she's protecting the baby Moses. We find in Exodus 15 that she's no longer a protector, but now she is a prophetess. She was held more accountable than Aaron in judgment before Moses. In Numbers chapter 12, obviously Zipporah had died and Moses had remarried, and they did not, Aaron and Miriam did not like the new wife of Moses. And so they're saying things about her, talking about her, murmuring and complaining about her. And so God says, bring them to the tent of meeting. So Moses brings Aaron and Miriam to the tent of meeting, and God strikes Miriam, not Aaron, Miriam with leprosy. It is ancient tradition that the person with the greater authority, the greater weight, and the greater responsibility gets the greatest punishment. So by God striking Miriam with leprosy, Miriam had the greatest authority and the greatest position. I mean, she led. She was a leader. She was not just another woman there to support Moses. She was a leader. She was a prophetess in Israel. She picked up a tambourine and led a nation in a dance and a shout of victory. So she was a leader. And prophetess, the word prophet, there's 3 words in Hebrew for prophet: navi, choseh, and roeh. The most typical word is navi, and it means to bubble forth with revelation, to bubble forth with insight. Anyone that's ever been used by God to deliver a prophetic word, I don't know how it feels to you, but it feels like something's just bubbling up inside of me. And when I open my mouth, it just comes out. It's like a bubbling forth. And so that's what Navi means. But it's a declaration. It is a speaking, preaching gift. And so to declare that Miriam is a prophetess is to declare that she is one who speaks forth the word of the Lord, which is the definition of preacher. So there is biblical reference to women preachers. She was held more accountable than Aaron in the judgment before Moses. And in Micah chapter 6, verse 4, she is remembered by all of Israel as a leader alongside Moses and Aaron. Over the entire nation of Israel, Aaron, Moses, and Miriam were the 3 major leaders over the entire nation of Israel. And then one of my favorite characters, I love Deborah. Deborah's just amazing. These are her 4 roles. You can read about her in Judges chapter 4. She is a prophetess. She is a judge. She is a warrior. And she is a respected spiritual leader. And it wasn't just women who went to her. All of Israel went to her. And when she prophesied to Barak that he would have victory in battle, Barak says to her, I will not go if you don't come with me. So now she's going to pick up a sword and go with Barak. And I love Barak's response because Deborah says, if I do that, it will be said this day that the victory has been given at the hands of a woman. And Barak says, I don't care who gets the credit for it. I just want victory. Guys, when will we reach that point that we don't care who's leading the lost to Christ just as long as the lost are getting saved? To where we stop putting people under a microscope? I know right now, and if someone listens 20 years from now to this teaching, you probably won't even know who I'm referring to, but social media is just buzzing with Kanye West's conversion. And is he or isn't he? Is his music or isn't his music? Who cares? People are getting saved and the gospel's being preached. When are we going to stop putting people under a microscope and trying to get them to jump through 20 hoops before we qualify them to do the work of the ministry? He just led probably 1,000 people to Christ. When was the last time we led someone to Jesus? Much less 1,000 people. Jesus said it like this: if they're not against you, leave them alone. They might not be preaching the same way you preach, but if they're preaching Jesus, leave them alone. So, who cares who gets the victory as long as there's victory? So, then there's Huldah. Huldah is a lesser-known prophetess, but she's a prophetess that was called to speak to both the priest and the king to interpret the law. Her story is in 2 Samuel chapter 22, and she was a prophetess during the time of Jeremiah. Now, what's happening, Josiah is the king. The king before Josiah was an evil king. He killed the priests. He destroyed copies of the law. All of them, or so they thought. And so Josiah becomes king, and one of the first things that Josiah does, he says, we've got to cleanse the temple. And that means that they are going to go and remove all the things that are profane. They're going to anoint the temple and once again set it aside to be used for sacrifices and for the glory of God. And while they're cleansing the temple and cleaning it out, someone discovers a copy of the law. In my imagination, because it's not in the pages of Scripture, but in my imagination, this is what it looks like. You've got priests everywhere, and they are cleaning. They're putting the holy anointing oil on everything. They are praying and declaring the name of the Lord all over the temple to sanctify it, to cleanse it, and to make it ready for the presence of God to once again inhabit. And in that cleansing, they're cleaning the stones that compose the temple. And one of the priests sees a little piece of paper, papyrus, peeking out between the stones, and he begins to ferret it out. And before long, he's got a copy of the law in his hands, where some priest probably hid it moments before his death. Most scholars believe that the copy of the law that they found was the book of Deuteronomy. And the reason they believe this is because that book was found during the ministry of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah quotes more from the book of Deuteronomy than any other book of the Torah. And so that's the standing reason. When they find a copy of the law, Hilkiah is the high priest, Josiah is the king. They look at it, and both of them say to each other, what does this mean? They have been without the law for so long that they don't even know what they're looking at. And they both say, Jeremiah's a prophet at this time. They don't say, let's call for Jeremiah and bring Jeremiah in. They don't call for one of the male prophets, and there would have been many of them. They say, call for Huldah, the prophetess, and she will tell us. This is a good place for me to interject this thought and idea for you. There were three major governing roles in Israel. There was prophet, there was priest, and there was king. You find a few mother queens along the way, but predominantly Israel, both the northern and the southern kingdoms, are led by male kings and not by mother queens. And if the mother queen is on the throne, it's for a short period of time until the son reaches age and he takes the throne. You find no female priestesses. And I'm going to give you some reasons for that in a little bit. But you find a prophetess at every point in Israel's history. R.K. Harrison, who is a well-known Old Testament scholar, in his book, Introduction to the Old Testament, he says that of the three offices, the prophet trumped them both because it was the prophet who could speak to both the king and the priest. The priest could not tell the king what to do. The king could not tell the priest what to do. But the prophet could tell them both what to do. And it was a woman who held office of prophet at every juncture in Israel's history. Ladies, if that does not put us in an elevated place of importance and show or give us a premise for leadership, I do not know what does. There's Miriam, there's Huldah, there's the 4 daughters of Philip. There's Deborah, who's a prophetess at every juncture. There's not a lot of them. But I mean, how many does it have to take? Or how many does there have to be? There's a woman that shows up as prophetess at every point in Israel's history. And so there's Huldah, a prophetess called to speak to both the priest and the king interpreting the law. She dwelt in Jerusalem at the Mishnah, which means double copy. This is the academic center of recalling and writing the law of God. She was obviously the best at it. She was smart. She was an academic. I love that. She was an academic prophetess. Therefore, she was sent to validate the copy of the law found during the cleansing of the temple. She was important. Even in the ancient culture, they respected and acknowledged her. And what about woman as warrior? There are women warriors all throughout the scripture. A paper that I would really love to write and present at an academic conference is Woman as Warrior in the Prophets. And Deborah, Yael, Hannah, and Ashesh Chael, which means woman of valor, in Hebrew, or virtuous woman. This Hebrew phrase is found throughout the Old Testament in reference to warfare. You can see Exodus 18 and Numbers 24. Proverbs 31 refers to the virtuous woman as the Eshet Chel, which means a woman of valor. The word valor is a military term, meaning that she is a woman of military might and strength and purity. So you see woman as warrior. In that intertestamental period, we have another woman that we're introduced to, and her name is Anna. Anna means grace. It's the same word as Hannah, and it means grace. Even though she's in the New Testament, her ministry begins before the birth of Christ. She's in Luke chapter 2, verse 36. And this woman, amazing woman, she would not die. Her husband died when she was young. She did not remarry. She served in the temple as an intercessor. And she refused to die until she saw the redemption of Israel. And when she saw Jesus, she was the first one other than Mary and Joseph that identified him as the Son of God. And she was a prophetess. So why are there no women priests in Israel? Well, let me give you 5 reasons, and this is written into your notes. The sheer strength needed for the physical labor. Even a man had to be between the ages of 30, and he could not serve after he was 50. Because before 30, a man would need to be able to impregnate his wife. And if he did too much heavy lifting, it might mess things up and prevent that from happening. So a man could not function in the office of priest. He could do other things, but it was at 30 that a man stepped into his role as priest, and then 20 years later, at 50, he had to step out of that role, because then he would have become too old and not muscular enough to do the daily physical labor that was required. So the sheer strength needed for the physical labor. Then the Canaanite influence. Female priestesses, especially the Canaanite female priestesses, were sexually objectified as temple prostitutes. We see that in the case of Hosea and Gomer. Gomer was probably a temple prostitute. She's probably not your garden variety of prostitute, but she probably had become a prostitute within the temple. So there were women who served in the temple, but even with that, the sons of Eli in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2, even with that, these women who served in the temple, Eli's sons objectified them and used them as temple prostitutes. Anna in the New Testament was also found in the service of the temple, but she was never objectified. She would not allow herself to be objectified. The 4th reason is that in order to be a priest, you had to be circumcised. Women could not be circumcised. And I will say this clear and I will say it loud. There is no biblical indication for female circumcision. It is wrong in every sense of the word and the idea. So women were not to be circumcised. And so in the Old Testament, in order to be able to serve as a priest, you had to be circumcised. But let me give you kind of a spoiler here. In the New Testament, circumcision is no longer the mark of the covenant. Baptism is. And women can be baptized. And so that becomes our circumcision. And so that requirement has now been cleared out. We've been taught that God favors men and does not desire a female presence in his temple. There is no support for that kind of thinking. All of the people of God were intended to be priests. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, God says, I will make you a nation of priests and kings. And he said that to the men and to the women. Melech, that's the word for king. Kings were the ministers of the people. They were to rule as God's shepherds over the people of God. They were the political leaders of Israel. They were subject to both the priestly and the prophetic offices. Then there are the priests, the Cohen. Priests were to minister to the Lord. They were the mediators of both legal and liturgical events. They could interrupt the political arena, but the political arena had no power over them. The priestly office was subject to the prophetic office. The Navi, the prophetic office. Prophets were the voice of God to both the priestly and political branches of Israel's government, as well as to the common man or woman. In the written account of Israel's history, there were no female priests. a smattering of queen mothers who reigned until their sons were of age, but at every juncture of Israel's history, there is a female in the role of prophet. The prophets were the spokespersons of God. They declared the word of the Lord in a forth-telling manner. Prophets were by and large forth-tellers, preachers, and not foretellers. For more on this subject, I've given you the information to see R.K. Harrison's introduction to the Old Testament.